of course, is the option that could see our planet reduced to inhospitable, unlivable conditions in a matter of minutes, while climate change is sort of the slow death that we're seeing for the planet. But in both cases, these really underline the risk to our entire planet and everything that lives on it, human and non-human. Very importantly, these are mutually reinforcing. So we see a lot that talk about how climate change and irresponsible environmental practices make war more likely. And this is, among other things, we can see it in the UN's Pact for the Future that was passed just this past September, unanimously by all members, that we see this direct link that climate change will lead to more conflicts. At the same time, it's also important to note that war and militarism are contributing to the worsening climate and environment that we're seeing around us. And I'll go a bit more into detail on that in a minute here. Military spending also is on the rise globally every year. And at the same time, we see just at the most recent COP in Azerbaijan, an inability of countries to come up with the necessary money for climate adaptation, for the loss and damage fund, among others. And we more generally see a lack of global cooperation, that countries do not want to work together to solve these issues, whether it be, as just mentioned, between the global historic rich countries, historic polluters, and the countries of the global majority or global south, whichever term you find useful in that context, and also a lack of global cooperation to resolve ongoing wars and violent crises that we're seeing from Ukraine to Gaza and so on and so forth, Sudan, DRC, Myanmar, Northeast Asia. I could keep going on, but it's clear with all the conflicts around the world, there really are no good faith cooperation to resolve these issues. And I have a brief quote here from Antonio Guterres. We confront a host of existential threats, and we do so at a time of chaotic transition, where we're seeing really a new world take shape that's different than the world we've seen for the past 30 years of the post-Cold War order. And I think it's important to mention that as well. Here's a longer quote. I won't read the whole thing for you, but this is from Antonio Guterres' new agenda for peace. On one hand, we see how reduced harvests and the destruction of critical infrastructure and displaced communities that have been results of extreme weather events and the changing climate exacerbate risks for new conflicts and new wars, and at the same time can create new areas, unanticipated areas of contestation around the globe, including territorial disputes and claims of territories. At the same time, a climate transition does serve as a possible avenue for peace building and for finding unity among peoples. But if we're unable to do this, really the effects of these overlapping crises will produce devastating effects for the entire planet and for development and human rights around the world. So going in first to climate and environmental conflicts, we have wars over resources, and typically, I mean, I don't think I have to go too much into detail on this. We all have quite seen well how countries, particularly my own home country of the USA, has used war and military interventions as a way to secure resources in other parts of the world, namely oil, but also minerals, water, land, and food can be areas where these wars are started over. And we also have increasingly militarized responses to climate emergencies that we're facing. And this is all sort of a feedback loop, as you can see with the image presented here, how one will lead to another, to another, to another, and they build off of each other. Here's just a brief graph from the Pacific Institute on water conflicts from 2000 to 2021. And we see three categories that are mentioned here. The first being where water is a casualty of a war. Basically, this would be where water could be polluted or infected or inaccessible due to wars. We see, of course, also situations where water is used as a weapon of war, where it's deprived from a certain people and used as part of the violence that they're inflicting on another group of people. And then the third one that we see, especially in recent years, has been growing quite extensively, is that water or lack thereof or access to water can be a trigger of violent conflicts and wars. I give one example from Nicaragua. Some of you may be aware of the socio-political crisis that began in 2018 in Nicaragua. This was due to a fire that started in the Indio Maiz Reserve in the country. And many sources have documented this was due to illegal deforestation, practices in the forest, but clearly also as we see that these wildfires are becoming more typical as the planet heats up, that this can actually generate a range of different crises within societies. A lot of Nicaraguans went to the streets to protest against the burning of the forest and the lack of a quick and adequate response from the government of Nicaragua, which led to a crackdown on the protests, and it devolved into much more than a protest simply about environmental matters, to really fundamental disagreements on the future of the country. I won't go too deep into that, but we see even the reverberations of the crisis from Indio Maiz continuing in Nicaragua through today. This is also another interesting graph when we look at how militaries are increasingly becoming more responsible for responding to extreme weather events and climate hazards that we're seeing around the world, whether it be extreme flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, cyclones, or tropical storms, droughts, and heat, that from the period of 2022 through 2024, this graph from the Council on Strategic Risks has documented 465 deployments of the military to respond to these extreme weather events. There are 85 militaries or 85 countries' militaries that have done so in 94 countries. And here we see another interesting aspect of how conflicts result from these climate crises, where particularly rich countries, annexed two countries under the FCCC, are sending a high number of arms to climate vulnerable countries that could or have already in many cases experienced conflict, either partially or completely due to climate-related reasons. So here we see another end of the spectrum. So I've gone through now basically conflicts that arise out of climate change. But the reverse end of that, as mentioned before, is that the increased militarization that we're seeing around the world is also driving climate change and environmental degradation. Important background notes here are that in climate agreements, from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, military emissions have been lobbied, particularly by the largest military powers in the world, to be left out of mandatory reporting. Actually, the 97 agreement excluded military emissions altogether. The 2015 Paris Agreement made reporting of military emissions voluntary. And because of these in particular, most countries are not transparent with how they report CO2 emissions by their militaries, and where this information is available, it's very complicated to tally up because they don't put it all under one place. Governments are not saying here is specifically what our military is using and producing in terms of CO2, but rather they'll divide it up into different categories. Here's what one F-35 fighter jet emits on a journey from X to Y destinations, and so it really takes a lot of work to understand what this means in practice and put all of that information together. At the same time, this is not, CO2 emissions are not the only way in which militaries are not green, we can say. There are, of course, war and militarism have destructive effects on the environment writ large, whether it be landmines, pollution, the destruction of natural habitats. We also have the question of funding priorities. As mentioned before, where is the money going to from our budgets, and why is it that there seems to be no money for the climate transition? And a deliberate attempt as well by many militaries to greenwash militarization processes and to keep these out of the scrutiny of climate movements. So this is a graph that a colleague of mine, Stuart Parkinson from the Scientists for Global Responsibility organization, had put together to try to visualize what they call the military carbon blueprints. And there are several ways to look at this and to calculate what is or is not included in military emissions. Quite importantly, sort of in the center there, you see the use of military equipment. I think this one is quite obvious that it falls specifically within that military category, whether it be exercises and patrols or actually war fighting. But if we look back to the left at some of the processes that go into that, we have the military tech industry at large is also quite a CO2 intensive industry. We have suppliers to military bases, for example, and the presence of these military bases. You know, the US network of military bases alone covers over 800 bases around the world. If we look at foreign military bases, for example, we also have waste management of what is produced at those bases. We have military land, which changes the landscape of areas. We also have the direct impacts of war fighting. If we look over to the right side of the screen here, you know, whether it be possible oil depot fires, deforestation, we have the healthcare of war casualties, and post-conflict reconstruction. When a war inevitably does come to an end, all the damage that has been done, it is extremely carbon intensive to basically rebuild an entire new city. So we do have some really good reports that have come out in recent years, one of which is by the Scientists for Global Responsibility and the Conflict and Environment Observatory. They released this 2022 report estimating military greenhouse gas emissions, and they based it on 4 categories, basically. Military personnel, the emissions from military bases per head, the ratio of mobile emissions to stationary emissions. So this is basically a way that they use to calculate, you know, when a fighter jet is flying and things of this sort, and the supply chain. So war fighting impacts were not directly included in the study, but basically everything that goes on behind the scenes. Their estimate that came out, and of course, keep in mind, this is before we've seen really the proliferation of wars in 2022, 2023, and 2024. The estimated total at that point was 5.5% of all CO2 emissions, or 2,750 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. If we put this into context, this is larger than Russia's total carbon footprint in the course of a year. We can visualize it here. These are the carbon footprints compared to the military carbon footprint compared to individual countries' reported totals. And we see, of course, China is the largest CO2 emitter, followed by the US, then India, and military emissions would fall into place right after that, larger than Russia, larger than Japan. And now, yeah, before I go to the next slide, maybe just to say here, I'll come back to a few more graphics visualizing this in a little bit and tying it also to some other issues that we have here. But this is the global total of adding up all militaries around the world. This is the total we get, but it is still quite a staggering figure. Looking at some of the other environmental and climate impacts of war, I'm just going to give a few examples here. There are really endless examples I could give, but the first is looking at the situation in Cambodia. with the placement of landmines during the conflict there. There's estimated total between the 1960s and 1990s of 4 to 6 million landmines. And throughout this process, those who were laying down the landmines had to clear out basically an entire tropical forest. Now, of course, this conflict has come to an end, at least, the version we saw at the time, though, there's no current active hot war going on in Cambodia. However, the mines have been placed and need to be cleared out, and clearing out 4 to 6 million mines takes a long time. We're now over 30 years after this period, and as of 2022, still 681 square kilometers remained contaminated with landmines. And the forest undergrowth is just beginning to reestablish now. So we see also the impacts of war do not end when a war ends, but actually continue for decades afterwards. Another example to give is the Red Hill water crisis in Hawaii. This is a case of the U.S. military base in which they were storing jet fuel in underground containers, which leaked and spilled in 2021, contaminating the drinking water supply for residents. The Navy claimed, even right afterwards, that the water was safe to drink, before eventually ordering an evacuation of the area. Still in 2024, we're seeing the health issues continuing from this crisis. And this is something really, it's as much as militaries may like to say, this is an isolated incident, it's quite a bit more common than we think. Contamination of local water supplies, which of course affect not only residents, but also the environment in the surrounding area, can have devastating consequences for the surrounding area. Maybe just also to mention here that most U.S. military bases have been found to use a particular fire retardant, which contains PFAS, polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are also known as forever chemicals. And there have been detected high percentages or parts per million of PFAS in drinking water and groundwater supplies in countries around the world where U.S. operates their military bases. Another example in Latin America is the Gorgona Island, and this example is one where we're actually looking more at the future. The U.S. and Colombia have agreed for the construction of a military base on Gorgona Island, supposedly as part of the National Guard. The island is a biodiversity hotspot with a lot of migratory species, dolphins, humpback whales. They call it home, as well as having a spiritual importance to indigenous and local communities in the surrounding area. And there has been a strong lack of transparency in official military and government reports on the environmental impacts of the military base construction, which is currently underway, and civil society groups in Colombia are calling them out and fighting the construction of this military base, citing independent and scientific reports on the true environmental consequences for this island, and that should the military base be constructed, there will be really no reversing the trend or bringing the biodiversity back to the island. So now I come to the funding section of my presentation quickly here, and just to plug another report, the Climate Collateral Reports of 2022 by the Transnational Institute, Stop Wapenhandel, and Tipping Point North-South. They found that the richest country, the Annex II countries, spend 30 times more on the military than they spend on climate finance. Looking at the period between 2013 and 2021, these richest countries spent 9.45 trillion on the military, while only 243 billion on climate finance. And it's important to note as well that 7 of the top 10 historical emitters are also in the top 10 military spenders. Here we can see a chart of global military spending based year by year. And of course, we can see the general trend of increasing military spending with a brief dip, around 2012, 2013, before really unprecedented rises in recent years. And I think it's quite clear that we will see the spending increase still in the years to come, with promises, for example, of many European countries to invest more in their militaries to meet, for NATO countries, for example, to meet the 2% of GDP or even 3% of GDP figures. So that trend is on the rise. We also see a breakdown by regions here, but in the next graph, I have it also by individual country figures here. Of course, the United States is by far the largest military spender at 39%, followed by China, Russia, and then you can read through the list here. But it's clear who these countries are who are devoting the most of their funding to the military. More recently, in 2024, a report by IPPNW, or the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, in Germany, as well as Centre de las, a peace research center, Tipping Point North-South, Stop Waffenhandel, and TNI, released a report called Climate Crossfire that specifically documents NATO's military spending as a military alliance and the largest military alliance in the world. If we look at the total figure in recent years, about a little over half of it is from the NATO alliance specifically. And as we know, generally the countries in the NATO alliance are historic polluters, are historically the colonial powers of the world as well. And their research exposed that if they were to instead spend their military spending on climate finance, it would cover the promises that they've already made of $100 billion a year for 12 years. Just 1 year of military spending would cover 12 years of that climate spending. And as mentioned before, with the 2% GDP target, this would mean that NATO countries would spend an additional 2.57 trillion US dollars in the next 4 years, up till 2028. And of course, this is the time that is most critical that we need to take action on climate change. And instead, we see increasing funding for the military. The graph at the bottom here, which is also from this Climate Crossfire report, just breaks down sort of some of the other ways that 1 year of NATO military spending could be used, looking at required external climate finance for low and middle income countries for 1 year, African countries' cost for climate adaptation and mitigation for 4 years, and climate adaptation costs for low and middle income countries for 3 years. You can see the figures for how much each of those cost just below them. A few more graphs related to this. We see global military emissions in 2022 at 1,221 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And here just a comparison to Japan's emissions in the same year, which you can see is less than that, or the emissions of 600 million cars over the course of a year, 500 million transatlantic flights, global annual shipping emissions, and global civil aviation annual emissions. I hope this can help to put it in perspective when we look at some of these other factors that we consider to be driving causes of climate change, that we consider to be significant areas to overcome in terms of preventing really the warming of the earth. Global military emissions are higher than these figures. Here, regarding the spending, we see, if we look at overall global military spending at 2.2 billion in 2022, this is a little bit less, but still quite close to the total financing needs for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. It's significantly more than the external climate finance for developing countries, and the adaptation costs, and also the very basic promise of 100 billion per year of the Paris Climate Agreement. Here's just a few more figures to go through in terms of other areas where we could be spending our military funding to cover 105.2 million solar households, retrofits, wind turbines, and electric buses, among others. Then quickly to mention the area of greenwashing, because particularly the richest countries often claim, whether it be in their official military reports, plans for the future years, or in press conferences, that they promise we're working to ensure that our fighter jets can run on renewable fuel, or that we'll have new technologies to reduce their impact on CO2 emissions. The Climate Collateral Report from 2022 basically called out this claim as a bunch of lies. They concluded that military climate strategies are vague and undefined, that really there are no fuel alternatives that can be used while keeping up what militaries tend to think of as most important, really the effectiveness of their machinery. And that their goals for net zero military emissions are reliant on technologies that either do not exist or that are not performing in the ways that they would need to make this a reality, such as the myth of carbon capture that we're seeing a lot. There's also newest generation, the F-35A fighter jets that have just been produced in the past year here and are being sold to governments around the world, are less green than earlier fighter jets, despite being the newest technology that is out there at the moment. And these are guaranteed to be used for at least 10, 15 years into the future. So we can predict already in the next 10 to 15 years that those emissions will go up based on these new generation technologies. And finally, it's the simple fact that war cannot be a green exercise. As we've seen, it's not just the CO2 emissions, but every aspect of war really is based on a domination that includes domination of the environment around you. And the practice there's no way to truly make it green. One final comment I have here is just that as we are making a green transition, there is one other risk that relates to conflicts, and that is that the technologies that we rely on for green technologies at the moment, including lithium for batteries, have the risk of just repeating the same crises that we've gone through, and the use of rich countries and their militaries to secure and maintain these resources for themselves. And that we must ensure that a climate transition is, of course, just and does not repeat cycles of colonialism and war that we've seen in the past. And so that's also part of the work that we're doing. Then finally, to mention that in order to achieve any of this, we need to improve global cooperation. We've seen in all international multilateral fora in recent years that political disputes, nationalistic priorities are really at the forefront, and the idea of cooperating and collaborating to solve these problems is just not there, despite the fact that these are issues that will affect us all, that cannot be contained within any borders around the world. And yeah, as the issues are interlinked, the solutions must clearly also be interlinked, coming from our governments. And of course, just to mention, while we're focusing here on militarism and climate change and environmental degradation in particular, really, as many, including the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, have emphasized, there are many more interlinked causes with these, all sorts of global inequalities that we're finding in our societies and on a global scale. Need to be addressed together, and I think it's important that we work to build these coalitions, that we're supporting each other's work, learning from one another, and where possible also campaigning for that change together. Finally, just to list a couple of the areas that we're active in at the moment, and where we could invite you, perhaps if you're interested, to join us. One is that we have a working group that meets usually once a month online, called the Arms, Militarism, and Climate Justice Working Group. We had just this past year our first Global Week of Action on Military and Climate Justice, that was in September of this past year, and we'll likely have another one most likely in the fall of 2025. So we would love to engage with you on that and work together on some activities. Also to connect you with many of our partners who are in this working group, who are the ones who wrote these reports. I can't stress enough. I wish I had any part in writing these reports that I presented to you here. But some of our colleagues are really doing that amazing work, and we're happy to connect you directly with them as well to develop anything further, or maybe there's some parts missing there. We also have every year the Global Campaign on Military Spending, and particularly Global Days of Action on Military Spending, typically in April and May of every year, where we call on governments around the world to redirect money from military purposes to social purposes, including climate change, including education, including meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and beyond. Then to mention, we have a campaign for common security. Common security, very briefly put, is the idea that no one nation state or peoples can make themselves safe at the expense of another, but that we need to create that security together, whether it be fighting climate change or preventing wars. The best strategies are building trust between societies and peoples, disarmament and reinvestment in that money for our common future together, and so on and so forth. If you're interested in learning more, you can find a complete report at the link, and we're also working currently on some regional reports on the topic. We also conduct a number of peace education courses where we try to connect peace to the other themes that are in people's lives. We are present in many different UN or international multilateral fora, including the Summit of the Future, which is where we had the great opportunity to meet with La Ruta de Clima this year. And we also do a lot of outreach and partnerships with others. There's a lot more than this, but I tried to list the areas closest connected to some of the climate issues as well. And just if you have any questions or would like any more information, our website is www.ipb.org. We're on social media. I'm realizing I forgot to include my own contact information, but I'll post that in the chat in case anyone's interested. I hope I did all right for time. I kind of lost track of time there, but yeah, I hope that's okay.
Thanks a lot, Sean. It was a great presentation. We have one comment here. Let me see. And if anyone has any question or comment, please put it on the Q&A or in the chat. So we have a comment from Serdar. I can say that last name, sorry. The U.S. military missions are the largest of any country worldwide, and this has been so every year over the last decade. The chart that you put China in the top is not consistent with this fact. Can you clarify this?
I can do my best. First, just to note, it's the chart specifically from the reports about estimating the military expenditures. But if I understand correctly, and again, I could be wrong on this, and I certainly don't want to be conveying false information here. I do believe that China is the largest CO2 emissions producer, but U.S. is larger per capita. And I think that might be the distinction, if I am remembering correctly there. So, per person, the U.S. emits more CO2. China, of course, has a much larger population, so it is natural that their overall CO2 emissions are higher. So I'm guessing that the charts is based on not per capita but general emissions, because I guess also with military emissions, it would be hard to really calculate a per capita of global military emissions.
Thank you. Voy a pasar a español porque me es más fácil preguntar en español, pero me parece, primero, súper interesante toda la información que nos presentaste y bastante retador viéndolo desde la perspectiva del cambio climático y desde la incidencia desde estos espacios. Entonces, tengo como una consulta que no sé si tendrás como la respuesta, Pero ¿qué se puede hacer, verdad? Desde la sociedad civil, desde los espacios en los que participamos, porque por más que haya manifestaciones, que haya posicionamiento, la inversión militar sigue creciendo y la inversión en cambio climático sigue siendo ínfima, por decirlo de alguna forma. Entonces, ¿qué acciones se pueden hacer desde los espacios en los que estamos como para tener más acción en este sentido de que toda esta inversión militar se dirija correctamente y que realmente empecemos a tener menores emisiones vinculadas al militarismo y mayor acción climática? No sé si tenés como algún comentario o recomendación.
Yeah, of course, of course. So I think the first and most important is education. You know, just to advocacy work to make sure everyone really understands this. We have, I think, quite a sizable climate movement, which of course has not been able to reverse the trends of certain countries, anyways. But I think one thing is we need to build really a larger movement that's understanding the systemic process of how this all is done and the connections between the areas. Because I think on one hand I can bring more people in when we're showing a bit of the larger picture around it. Certainly, to campaign with these ideas together as a larger movement also could create that critical will. I know it's tough to say what will work for sure because it seems like every strategy we're trying is not working. But I think the coalition building, bringing these themes together onto the streets is a very important step as well. To say, as we say, the peace movement right now, we have to say the peace movement is not so big. The climate movement is a little bit more sizable than us. And so we see also a need to bring those together when we're out on the street to show a larger group that's demonstrating on the issues and that understand that they can't be conquered alone. That being said, I think one of the important strategies really is the building of trust between nations, the building of cooperation between nations. And as the first quote I had given from Guterres had mentioned, the world is changing at the moment. We're seeing a loss of power of the global north countries, the Western countries, historically the rich polluter countries, are losing the influence that they've had over the rest of the world. That there are other opinions and views that are emerging. And given these changes, I think we do have a unique opportunity at this moment to really be calling for changes to global governance, to changes in interactions between nations, to establishing greater trust between nations. When we talk about climate change, and I won't claim to be an expert on climate change, but I know, when the U.S. talks about its emissions, as someone from the U.S., immediately, most of the politicians will say, well, what about China? What about China? And it shouldn't be a competition, right? It doesn't matter who's emitting. The bottom line is that we have to lower those figures. And if we have an atmosphere of trust between nations, that we understand we're in this together, we can only survive this together. That I think is an important change that we can be pushing for in these critical moments of global shifts that could have a greater effect. I think especially international solidarity and support is another important key, that wherever we are in the world, that we're working on these issues together and that we're applying local contexts. I know Costa Rica, for example, does not have a military, right? So there, maybe the campaign itself isn't so much about military spending in Costa Rica because that's not getting anywhere, but more of perhaps a regional approach or working with some partners in other parts of the world. Here's how climate change is affecting us, and here's how militarism is affecting us, and then we can see where the connections are and how to push that forward together.
Muchas gracias, Sean. Aquí tengo otra comentario. Dice, fue una gran plática, pero creo que también es importante mencionar las formas en que los planes de recuperación o los planes durante los desastres están en manos de los militares que muchas veces causan abusos a las poblaciones afectadas. Es algo que he visto por testimonios, pero me pregunto si habrá datos más específicos sobre esto.
Very good question. It's something that I've only personally started to look into more recently. When I saw, for example, this graph I showed earlier about how military is increasingly being used as a response to extreme weather events. I personally, I don't have any data at this point about that. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure there's some out there, and certainly I'd like to look more into that as well. And perhaps, yeah, explore what we could do to resolve that. I would say, for one, to use militaries, which are a tool specifically for war fighting, whatever form that may take, as a way of supposedly protecting civilians in natural disasters is already a recipe for disaster, while at the same time legitimizing an omnipresence of the military in all atmospheres. So I would say probably we would need, instead of the military, specific response forces that are there for climate disasters, for weather emergencies, to respond to those that is not the military.
Actually, como en las últimas 2 semanas, tuvimos muchas inundaciones acá en Costa Rica y hubo una crítica muy fuerte porque el país recibió apoyo de los militares de El Salvador. Entonces, sí hubo como todo este cuestionamiento alrededor de por qué teníamos que aceptar militares dentro del territorio, ¿verdad? Hubo posiciones muy opuestas al respecto. Y definitivamente vinieron a ayudar, lo cual es muy valioso, pero sí creemos que debería de, o sea, tal vez esa inversión militar debería de ser más bien en recursos para respuesta humanitaria ante eventos climáticos, ¿verdad? Porque tal vez todos estos recursos que se están usando en los ejércitos podrían ser mucho mejor canalizados y dar una respuesta humanitaria mucho más, tal vez no respuesta humanitaria, tal vez hasta respuesta a eventos climáticos, a daños y pérdidas de una manera mucho más estratégica. Te agradecemos mucho, Sean, por el espacio. No sé si hay más preguntas o comentarios de las personas que nos acompañaron, pero no veo por acá ninguna otra. De verdad, nos gustó mucho el espacio. Muchas gracias por sacar el tiempo y por preparar esta presentación tan interesante. Esperamos poder seguir colaborando en diferentes espacios y le extendemos nuestro agradecimiento también a las personas que nos acompañaron el día de hoy. Si quieren conocer más acerca de nuestro trabajo, les invitamos a consultar nuestras redes sociales como La Ruta del Clima o nuestro sitio web www.larutadelclima.org. Nuevamente, Sean, muchísimas gracias y que tengas muy bonito día. Y nos están pidiendo por acá en el chat los datos de contacto, si los puedes compartir para que las personas te puedan contactar.
Ahí lo dejo. Es mi nombre con punto en el medio, at ipv-office.berlin. Pero ahí está, me pueden contactar y muchísimas gracias. Perdón que no logré hacer todo en español, pero para la próxima podría ser.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias más bien y que tengan muy bonito día. Nos vemos, hasta luego.
Gracias. Chao.